Alright, listen up, you smooth brain, crayon eating motards. It's time to talk about the real impacts of the Russian sanctions. So, we're going to just read right through this. December 13th, 2022, Congressional Research Service informing the legislative debate since 1914. So, you know that this information is hot, hot, hot garbage since it is prepared by people involved in the government who don't know their ass from their elbow, but either way, we're going to go through it. This is supposedly the best information, um, but it is by no means complete. No single source is ever going to give you enough information to make informed decisions, even if they're fucking telling you the truth. They have their own implicit biases and agendas. It's just who we are. We're people. We're always trying to push shit. We're always trying to reinforce our tribal belief. Our group believes this. MAGA, the left, progressives, religious people, atheists, whatever group you're a part of, you're all going to have your little collective belief, your little groupthink that you want to bring other people into. Let's indoctrinate them. Anyway, enough nonsense. Let's talk. Let's get into the factual data right now. So, in response to Russia's 2022 war on Ukraine, a broad multilateral coalition, including the United States, the EU, UK, Canada, Australia, Japan, and others, imposed sweeping new sanctions on Russia. The sanctions, unprecedented in terms of scope, coordination, and speed, target the overseas wealth and economic activity of Russia's elites and decision makers. The sanctions also target Russia's financial and energy sectors and access to Western technology, among other financial and trade tools. The sanctions have created challenges for Russia, but to date have not delivered the economic knockout that many predicted. New sanctions on Russian oil exports implemented in December 2022 may increase economic pressure on the government. Although sanctions are a foreign policy tool deployed in several contexts, the coordinated sanctions on Russia are significant to the global economy due to the size of Russia's economy. Before the war, the 11th largest in 2021, and Russia's integration into the global economy. In addition to its oil and natural gas exports, Russia has been a key global supplier of several metals: titanium, aluminum, and nickel. Russia is sitting on a shitload of titanium, by the way. Chemical gases used in semiconductor production, wheat, fertilizers, and among other commodities. Many U.S. and international firms have also established factories, joint ventures, and retail operations in Russia and face losses as they exit the Russian market. Impact on Russia's economy. Early in the war, the broad consensus was that the new sanctions could devastate the Russian economy. Since the start of the war in February 2022, sanctions have created numerous economic challenges in Russia. For example, Russia's financial sector faces losses of hundreds of billions of dollars. The Russian military is having difficulties procuring key components for its war effort. Many Russian factories have suspended production because they cannot access foreign-made parts. Many affected companies are placing employees on part-time schedules or furlough. Hundreds of U.S. and international companies have exited the Russian market, and Russian oil is selling below market prices. By other metrics, however, the Russian economy has weathered the sanctions better than many expected. In October 2022, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, estimated that in 2022 Russia's economy would contract by 3%, less than half of its economic disruption during the global financial crisis of 2008 through 2010. Figure 1. Additionally, IMF's forecasts suggest that the 2022 uptick of inflation in Russia and its decline in exports will be temporary. Figure 1. Russia's oil exports to non-U.S. destinations, largely exempt from sanctions until December 5, 2022, have been an important source of government revenues. So as we can see, this is figure 1. You've got your global financial crisis in 2008. The invasion of Crimea pretty much brought them down to baseline. COVID just below baseline, and now the war on Ukraine, they are sliding. Their growth, this is all predicted. So they were growing. This is predicted, forecast. So, I mean, these are all on uptrends. Unemployment was down. Looks like they're predicting flat. There is some evidence that economic conditions in Russia are starting to deteriorate at a faster rate. In November, the Russian central bank estimated a faster economic contraction in Q4 2022 7.1 relative to previous quarters in 2022, around 4%. Sanctions may be a contributing factor. It often takes time for the full effect of sanctions to materialize, but other factors are likely contributing as well, most notably the war effort itself, including the mobilization of civilian production for military purposes, workers drafted to military service, and deferred domestic infrastructure projects has created economic disruptions. The recent expansion of oil sector sanctions is expected to increase pressure on Russia. In December 2022, the EU banned imports of most Russian crude oil, and the G7 implemented a global price cap on Russian oil purchases. These new oil sanctions could reduce government revenues, exacerbating budgetary pressures resulting from higher war expenditures. And we blew up the pipeline. I mean, that's not official news, but we're not blaming anybody. We're just kind of making it go away. So I don't believe that the Biden administration had no clue that this was going on. I'm fairly certain that these people are responsible. The U.S. government and their agents are either involved or directly responsible. Not quite sure because no one is owning up to that. Economic impact outside of Russia. Boom, here we go. Here's the meat and potatoes. But they don't give us charts and they don't give us of any sort of numbers of decline in these. Like the United States has no information about what we're doing that correlates to the Russian pressure. Anyway, sanctions that isolate Russia are a shock to the global economy, which is still struggling to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. The sanctions have likely contributed to disruptions in global supply chains, higher global commodity prices, and a slowdown in global economic growth. The IMF forecasts that the global economic growth will slow from 6% in 2021 to 3% in 2022 and 2.7% in 2023, but it is difficult to assess the effect of sanctions separate from other contemporaneous factors, including the war, tighter monetary policy, higher interest rates, in many advanced economies, and COVID-19 related supply disruptions primarily in China. The United States. The United States has never had substantial economic relationships with Russia. Russia and the USSR prior to 1992. The USSR prior to 1992 has accounted for less than 3% of annual U.S. exports and imports since World War II. However, sanctions may have significant effects on specific U.S. companies and sectors engaged with Russia. For example, there may be concerns about the exposure of particular U.S. financial institutions to Russia, the availability of raw materials from markets outside Russia, and the competitiveness of U.S. firms. Concerns also focus on whether reduced Russian energy supplies could lead to higher gas prices and exacerbate inflation. Europe and energy. Among the coalition imposing sanctions, the EU has been Russia's strongest economic partner and faces the greatest economic disruption. Europe has been dependent on energy imports from Russia, especially natural gas, and EU sanctions on Russia exempted certain energy-related exemptions through December 5th, 2022. Natural gas from Russia to the EU has fallen by more than half since the war started. European governments are stockpiling fuel and providing emergency financial assistance to households and businesses. The expansion of oil sanctions could further destabilize global markets. Food security. The sanctions include exemptions to minimize humanitarian costs. For example, the war has disrupted global grain and fertilizer markets, increasing concerns about global food insecurity. U.S. and EU sanctions do not prohibit the exportation of agricultural commodities from, to, or involving Russia. Transactions involving agricultural trade are exempt from financial sanctions. Countries outside the sanctions coalitions. Current sanctions on Russia are multilateral but not global, and Russia is seeking deeper economic relationships with countries outside the sanctions coalition. For example, Russia's exports to Brazil, China, India, and Turkey have increased by at least 50% since 2022 war started relative to the previous year. However, Russia's ability to engage in cross-border transactions remains hindered by the sanctions. The extent to which countries outside the sanction coalition are willing to risk potential fallout with the United States, the EU, and others by significantly increasing economic engagement with Russia is also unclear. The impact on the structure of the global economy. The new sanctions responding to Russia's aggression could have lasting effects on the structure of the global economy. The sanctions could create or deepen fractures in the global economy, resulting in disparate economic blocs and schisms that could undermine the international rules-based economic order that the United States has prioritized since World War II. On the other hand, a coalition of like-minded economies led by the United States and Europe could create opportunities for significant new economic agreements. Sanctions also could accelerate efforts by various countries, and particularly China, to reduce their reliance on the US dollar in international transactions. This is happening. The BRICS nation group is discussing de-dollarization and trading oil off of the petrodollar. Sanctions could accelerate efforts by various countries, particularly China, to reduce their reliance on the US dollar in international transactions and Western cross-border payments infrastructure more generally. The freeze-on of Russia's central bank assets, in particular, could make the countries reconsider their holdings of and use of the dollar. If de-dollarization efforts gain traction on a broader scale, U.S. borrowing costs could increase and sanctions could become a less effective policy tool, thus shooting ourselves in the foot. I add that part. Policy questions for Congress. Sanctions have imposed some costs on Russia, disrupted global energy markets, and created economic opportunities for countries outside the sanctions coalition, including China. Most U.S. sanctions imposed on Russia through in 2022 were implemented by the Biden administration through executive orders. As Congress exercises oversight of U.S. sanctions on Russia and considers the role of the legislature in formulating U.S. sanctions policy, possible policy questions include: what is the ultimate goal of sanctions on Russia? That's a good question. Are the sanctions advancing the United States and allies toward these goals? And are they punishing Russia drastically more than they're punishing the NATO countries? I added that part too. Are decision makers in Russia responsive to economic pressure? Are more sanctions needed? Under what conditions should sanctions be lifted? How long can the United States sustain multilateral cooperation on sanctions? What would be the consequences of weakened cooperation? Should the United States provide economic support to U.S. companies and industries affected by the sanctions? How should the United States engage with countries increasing economic engagement with Russia? Should Congress codify sanctions implemented through executive orders? And that's it. Now there's a disclaimer. So, we got a couple things to talk about here. Let's see. So, this is brand new. Poland is stopping sending weapons to Ukraine amid grain fight. Polish PM said he's pulling back military support to Ukraine. You've got media blackout in Lahaina and the front lines in Ukraine. Both places, it's going really, really well. That's why they don't want the media to show you what's going on, right? That makes sense. And then the United States has still not considered or even tabled the possibility of negotiating punishing conditions for a Russian surrender. We want Ukrainians to die. We want more Russians to die. We do not want to set foot near a negotiating table. We just want death. Or at least that's what the current administration wants. No discussions for peace on the horizon. Just continued sanctions as the BRICS nations coordinate and start to de-dollarize and talk about having a gold-backed currency, which would send the price of gold skyrocketing. By the way, if you have a gold bug, that could be really good for you. I think that the price of gold has been artificially suppressed because it is needed for manufacturing critical electronic components. So they can't allow gold to go to 10,000 an ounce or beyond because it would fuck everything. It would fuck all the electronics companies. It would be the end of cheap shit for you to buy from China, because anything that has gold as a conductor on a contact point, I mean, would be 5 times more expensive just on gold costs. You'd go from 2,000 an ounce to 10,000 an ounce overnight, and that's conservative. Depending on the adoption level of the BRICS currency, if it does come out and it is backed by gold, it could go beyond that. I have no idea. I'm not a gold specialist. I'm just saying that if a currency goes back to gold and gold is no longer just a material used in manufacturing of goods and is back to be used as a currency, this is why we can't allow it, man. This is why the U.S. banned exchanging the dollar for gold because there's just not enough gold once we started using it for practical purposes. Um, trying to think before we. So Zelensky, the other thing I just would mention before I end this is Zelensky had a peace deal with Russia. This war began. No, I don't think that's. Yeah. Did Putin? How do I find the real information on this? Because it says Putin rejected it. Then it says Zelensky. This is Sky News. This is 26 January 2023. This is September 14, 2022. What were these deals? Let's see. Russian. Give me some more information. USA Today. Peace negotiations. April 2022. So 21 March. 29, 30 March. So there are claims. Patrushev went on to say, in the morning, they, members of the Ukrainian delegation, gave the proposals to us during the negotiations, and in the evening they said, no, we give up. This happened only because the United States had put pressure on them and said that no negotiations must be held, the Secretary of Russia Security Council stressed. As he pointed out, there are interested parties in this conflict. First and foremost, the United States and Great Britain. Istanbul document. First Russia and Ukrainian negotiations after Russia launched its special military operation in Ukraine took place in Belarus early in March 2022. Yielded no tangible results. A new round took place in Istanbul. Vladimir Medinsky announced that Moscow had for the first time received Kiev's principles of a possible future agreement in writing, stipulating in particular Ukraine's neutral, non-aligned status, commitments, and its refusal to deploy foreign troops and armament, including nuclear weapons, on its soil. Russia pulled out its forces from Kiev and Chernigov areas. However, the negotiations on the peaceful settlement were totally frozen after that, and as Russian Vladimir Putin said, Kiev gave up the accords reached in Istanbul. A lot of confusion here, but it does sound like Ukraine walked away at the behest of the U.S. to me. I mean, um, China has ideas for peace. Anyway, let's wrap it up. This is enough. If you disagree with that assessment, please just send me some sources that I can look at to see um, information showing clearly that Putin was the one that walked away from the table. And I would prefer if there was more than one source, because just one, shithole website that nothing is corroborated from, I generally don't believe single sources. There needs to be at least two that are kind of saying something similar. That's the goal, is to find, I'm a little bit more thorough when I'm not burning film. You know what I mean? The film is running. Film doesn't grow on trees, okay? So we got to wrap this up. I hope that you found the assessment interesting. I will post the link for that. This economic impact of Russia sanctions report prepared for Congress. So, anyway, take care, and I will see you guys again soon.